Now it's my pleasure to introduce Minnesota's State Historic Preservation Officer, Steve Elliott. Steve took the helm at the Minnesota Historical Society as its Director and State Historic Preservation Officer on May 1st. Prior to coming to Minnesota, he was President and Chief Executive Officer of the New York State Historical Association and the Farmers Museum. He served on numerous museum, history, education, and civic boards, and currently chairs the American Association of State and Local History. I've only had the pleasure of working with Steve for a few short months, but I can already tell you that he brings personal passion for history, a deep respect for the work that's gone before, an accessibility that's energizing the entire staff at the Minnesota Historical Society, and a sincere desire to get to know our many partners in history and historic preservation. We have a lot of his time during the conference, and I know he's looking forward to talking with many of you one-to-one throughout the day. Please join me in welcoming Steve Elliott.
Good morning. It is wonderful to be in Faribault. This is my first time here, and I loved walking up the street this morning and just looking at this streetscape. What buildings to work with. If you haven't gone up to this corner and turned right yet, look at the second story on the building beside Grandpa Al's. It's just gorgeous. What a place. And look at this. I think of all the theaters I've seen wrecked in my career because they couldn't figure out how to make it work. But if you look at this theater, look at all that's going on here, the use they've made of the second floor, and how important this is to the city. I just think it's inspirational. I really tip my hat to this community. Now, this is a little awkward. Brita and I talked about how I would use this time, and she said, well, you have to start by telling people about who you are in your career and what you're bringing to your position as State Historic Preservation Officer. And I just go, oh, God, who wants to get up and talk about himself, Who wants to hear it? So this is a little bit of biography by building. I mean, we're preservationists, right? We like to look at buildings. So I thought I would, this first segment is just a little bit about some of the things that I've been involved with. And then we're going to tag team. Brita's going to talk about some of the preservation initiatives that are underway in the state. Then I get to come back up and talk about, share some ideas about being effective in historic preservation. So, this has been an interesting reflection. For as long as I can remember, I have loved, as in can't possibly get enough of, history, old buildings, biography, old stuff, antiques, museum collections, auctions, flea markets, and art. And interesting, Bonnie and I were together the other day, and Bonnie was talking about her interest. Where does this come from? Probably, 3/4 of you in the audience. You're like that too. You're just nuts about history and old buildings and all. Where's it come from? And I'm not sure. I was born in Baltimore and grew up in Western Maryland, and I know this. Almost every weekend we visited my grandparents, who lived in a little town called Newmarket, Maryland. And what was distinctive about Newmarket, it's about 30 or 40 miles west of Baltimore. And while the town was settled in the late 18th century, what catapulted that town was the creation of the National Road. Now, if you know the National Road extended from Baltimore through the Cumberland Gap. It was, from about 1820 to 1850, 3 million people went over that road, headed west, maybe to Minnesota. And, you get a little ways out of Baltimore in a coach, or pulling a wagon, you got to spend the night. That was what developed Newmarket. It's only now about a little town of about 500 people, but it is a stretch of about 1 mile along what was the National Turnpike of these late 18th, early 19th, mid-19th century buildings. And it's essentially the antiques capital of Maryland at this point. So this is a really poor shot of Newmarket. But my grandparents' house was just off of this to the left. It was one of those 19th century homes. And my mother was one of 9 siblings, and my cousins and I, growing up, were just all through that house, all through that town, all through those buildings, and just absolutely loved it. And then the other thing about where I grew up was, where's the advancer? Here it is. Let's see if, was that I grew up in Washington County, Maryland. And the thing about Washington County, Maryland, is it was where the Antietam battle, the Battle of Antietam was fought in the Civil War. So this was a town, a locale very rich in history. And I had parents and especially a father who really appreciated all of that. And our idea of a good time in growing up was to load into that station wagon. It had that wood paneling, fall wood paneling and stuff. And we'd take vacations and go to presidents' homes and battlefields. Other people were going to the beach. Hey, who would rather go to a battlefield, right? So I remember as a kid a trip through Virginia. And we went to Mount Vernon, we went to Monticello, just fabulous places. We went to Ashelawn, Monroe's home. And we went to Woodrow Wilson's birthplace in Stanton, Virginia. And the 2 special things I remember about that trip was, one, I lost my wallet at Monticello. It came back in the mail about a year later. But something special happened at Stanton and at Woodrow Wilson's birthplace, and that was I visited with my family, and this is 50 years ago. They had the stanchions and the docent and so forth. And when the docent was talking about the room, and she pointed to an object by the fireplace and said, "Do you know what that is?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Well, come on around the barrier and go get it. You won't tell anybody, and bring it over here." And I just thought, man, this is the greatest thing in the world. All this stuff they talk about in education about being interactive and hands-on, and it is very important. Stuck in my mind, but I was hooked before. I was hooked at that point. I wanted to spend my life, holding things like this, being in buildings like this, talking about people like Woodrow Wilson. But preservation. I think my earliest awareness as a kid of historic preservation, though wouldn't have been in those terms, had to do with a building in Hagerstown, Maryland. And just about 2 blocks from the main square in Hagerstown. Hagerstown was settled about in the 1740s by German immigrants. It was the frontier at that point. And there was a building about 2 blocks from the main square, prominently situated. And in the early 19th century, the gentleman who lived here was Nathaniel Rochester. Now, I don't think this Mr. Rochester ever made it to Rochester, Minnesota. But interesting story. There are interesting people stories behind buildings. Nathaniel Rochester had been born in the 18th century in Virginia. He brought his family to the frontier in western Maryland, to Hagerstown, where he was a very successful businessman. And if you look at this house, you can see he was very successful. But he was not satisfied. He saw more opportunity as the frontier moved. And he picked up his extensive family and moved to upstate New York, where he was the founder of Rochester, New York. And when he got to New York, he bought a very simple plank home, which you can now visit at Genesee Country Village outside Rochester. I think it's one of those great, interesting people stories that's sort of reflective of early America. But back to Hagerstown. So this house, I love this house. I never was in it, but when we would go to town, there were no shopping malls at that time, so there was great downtown in Hagerstown, and I loved going by this house. And then one day my folks said, well, you take another good look at it because it's not going to be there much longer. What do you mean? Well, they're going to tear it down for a parking lot. And this photo was made 2 weeks before raising operations started on the Rochester house in 1956. And it went. And today there is still the parking lot, although they have now painted a likeness of the building on the wall, the parking lot. How sad. How sad to lose that. We lost a lot of buildings in that time. I really thought that was tragic, and I was just a kid, So I did. I pursued my love of history like many of you. I went to Cornell. I was a history honors guy, but I took equal concentrations of history of art and education. I went to grad school at William and Mary in Virginia, and I was very fortunate that after my first year of coursework, I was admitted as a fellow to the Seminar for Historical Administration, which was a 6-week program, half grad students, half museum professionals, that was co-sponsored by the American Association of Museums, American Association for State and Local History, Colonial Williamsburg, the National Park Service, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And the then president of the National Trust, Mr. Biddle, I think James Biddle, came down and met with the participants. And that was really my introduction to the National Trust. And that seminar and Mr. Biddle, right after the seminar, I was offered a job at Colonial Williamsburg. Still said, I don't know if I can do it. I've got another year of coursework to do. But I didn't want to pass up an opportunity, so really worked my tail off for a year doing both things, and ended up staying at Colonial Williamsburg for 28 years. And during that time, my relationship with the trust deepened. My boss, the CEO of Colonial Williamsburg, was the chair of the National Trust. Subsequently, the chair of the board of Colonial Williamsburg, Colin Campbell's wife, Nancy, chaired the trust as well. Had a little bit of acquaintance with Dick Moe, not a lot, but Jim Vaughn, who headed the Historic Sites program, has been a good friend for many years. I'm a huge fan of how the trust has grown and increased its effectiveness over the decades. While Colonial Williamsburg, there are interesting preservation challenges. You may know that there are 88 original buildings at Colonial Williamsburg, and some of the most significant buildings are reconstructed. This is the Capitol, but this is Weatherburn's Tavern, which is one of the original 88 original buildings. And there were also opportunities. This original 18th century building had not been restored. The life tenant lived for a long, long time after signing the agreement. And when she passed away, I was the project manager for its restoration, for adaptive reuse as a guest house, as a part of the Williamsburg Inn, and as the place where that would be a special quarters, for donors who are coming in. And it was a real pleasure to work with a gentleman who actually funded the restoration. It was a $1.4 million project, and that was a nice hands-on experience. And we had other preservation issues as well. This is a 1928 drawing by Arthur Shurtleff of the of Carter's Grove Plantation, which for many years was owned and presented to the public by Colonial Williamsburg. I developed the interpretive and site plan for that, and then this is a school that was built as the black school in the 1930s. It was declared surplus by the school board. It was going to build a larger new school outside of town in the early 90s. And Colonial Williamsburg, because this property is very close to the historic area and we were looking to expand some of our support facilities, we acquired the property, and I did the initial planning for the facilities there with the team. Bruton Heights School is on the right. We added a new library building on the left to the campus, and the building in the upper corner is our collections and conservation facility, which would be analogous to the lower two levels of the History Center in St. Paul here. And finally, at Colonial Williamsburg, we had a couple of buildings that survived that there were anomalies in the 18th century setting. Two spinsters lived long, long lives in their home right by the Capitol on Duke of Gloucester Street. And when they passed away, it was just assumed in the community that somehow we would find a way to work with the family to acquire the house and tear it down, because so many Victorian homes had been torn down in completing the restoration and reconstruction of buildings in the historic area. But you know what? Times change. And we were able to gain internal support and community support so that when we did have the opportunity to acquire the property, this house was moved all the way up to the college end of Duke and Gloucester Street, a mile away, took a right turn, went 2 blocks, and was put in a neighborhood of Victorian homes. So Colonial Williamsburg was able to reconstruct the 18th century coffee house on whose foundations this house was built, and this house was saved and is now being used and appreciated. I have to say it was my pleasure in my career at Colonial Williamsburg to actually live on Duke of Gloucester Street for 18 years. I moved on from Colonial Williamsburg to Richmond, Virginia, where I headed a small educational not-for-profit focused on the First Amendment and something that was new in the history of mankind, religious freedom. We owned the site in Richmond where the Virginia House adopted Thomas Jefferson's statute for religious freedom in 1786. But adjacent to that site were a row of buildings that we owned, and they looked worse than this. This actually does them justice. And inside there had been a fire where some homeless folks had started a fire to keep themselves warm. The center was kind of burned out, very bad shape. And what we negotiated while I was there was a reuse of that property with a developer. The property was in the Shockoe Slip Historic District, which is on the National Register. And we rehabilitated those buildings so that the first floor business suites here became the offices of the First Freedom Center. The rest of, this is looking at it from another direction, it's actually about a half a dozen buildings together. The rest were developed into apartments as a long-term lease to the developer, and then a lease back to us for office space, just to kind of give you a sense of the scale of it. And again, for me, it was a very useful hands-on experience to go through those negotiations and the planning, and before I left, the construction was actually underway. Finally, I went to, as Brita said, New York, and where most of the preservation I was involved with had to do, as a Colonial Williamsburg, with maintaining a variety of structures on the campus of the Farmers Museum, buildings that had been moved to the Farmers Museum, sort of a la Sturbridge, and in the creation of a village-scape and streetscape. I am absolutely loving Minnesota. I would say that it is unusual, if not unique, to have communities in a state that are so committed to their cultural heritage, and how Minnesotans have supported the various initiatives in Minnesota from the beginning, from when the territorial legislature created the Minnesota Historical Society 50 years before New York State started a historical association, is just amazing. And I also cannot say enough about our staff. If the auditorium weren't so dark, I would ask everybody who is here that's on the staff of the Minnesota Historical Society to stand and be recognized, just because they are exceptional professionals and a real pleasure to work with. So I'm sorry to bore you with all that, but Brita twisted my arm. I have loved being a part of our movement to save for the future some of the wonderful buildings and the great stories of people who have come before us. And I know we're going to continue to do a heck of a job of that in Minnesota.